I keep coming back to the smell of it. That's the thing no one talks about when they describe what happened in Zawame in those last months. Everyone remembers the vines, the black shimmer of the dimensional tears, the sound the overlords made when they moved, that deep grinding thrum like tectonic plates deciding to argue. But nobody mentions the smell. Helheim smelled like overripe fruit left too long in the sun, sweet at first and then rotting underneath. And by the time you could place the scent clearly, you were already breathing spores you didn't want inside you. I spent 11 months breathing that air. It's part of me now, the same way the guilt is. You don't scrub out either one. My name is Mitsuzane Kirishima. Some of you will know that name for reasons I'd rather not dwell on. Most of what I did in the 18 months before the final battle I've made my peace with, or tried to. My brother Takatora has forgiven me, which is more than I deserve, and what he thinks of me matters more than what anyone else does. The city is clean now. The forest is gone. Kauta is gone too, in the way that gods go, not dead, not absent exactly, just operating at a distance that human eyes were never meant to measure. I try not to think about what it cost him to get there. What I'm going to tell you about is the 3 days that came after the world almost ended a second time. The first ending, the real one, the confrontation between Kauta and Kaido, the forbidden fruit, the man who became something beyond a man and the city he left behind. That story has been told well enough by people who were closer to the center of it than I was. I was barely standing by the time Kauta and Mai left. I had nothing left to spend. I was 20 years old. I had betrayed every person I cared about at least once, and the only thing keeping me on my feet was the fact that my brother needed me upright, and the city needed someone with a Sengoku driver who wasn't currently colonizing a new planet. So I stayed. I stayed, and Takatora stayed, and Zack stayed. Zack, who had watched his best friend grow into something monstrous and kept fighting beside him anyway. Which is the kind of loyalty that makes you feel inadequate just being in the same room with it. Oren stayed, which nobody would have predicted 18 months earlier, but Oren Pierre Alphonse had turned out to be exactly the person you wanted at your back when the world was ending. Loud, theatrical, absolutely immovable, and carrying a pair of pastry irons that he'd learned to use as weapons with a precision that shamed soldiers half his age. And Janauchi was there, Hideyasu Janauchi, who had spent most of the war being terrified and had chosen to keep showing up anyway, which in my view is a more honest form of courage than the kind that doesn't feel fear. We were 5 riders left in Zawame, 5 Sengoku drivers, 5 sets of lockseeds, and a city of 200,000 people who were trying to remember how to live without a corporate leviathan controlling their water and their roads and their air. Yggdrasil Corporation was gone. The towers were dark. The laboratories were sealed. The experiments that had been running in the sublevels, the drivers, the dimensional breach technology, the harvested spores, all of it was locked behind blast doors that Takatora had personally coded with keys only he and I possessed. Not because we intended to use any of it, because we'd made a promise that no one else would either. The first 6 weeks after Kauta left were quiet, unnaturally quiet, in the way that the space between lightning and thunder is quiet, not peaceful, just the absence of something that's building somewhere you can't see it yet. We did patrols. We helped people clear the last of the vine growth from the outer districts. We ate bad food in the break room of what had been Yggdrasil's logistics hub and played cards, and didn't talk about anything important. And Takatora watched me the way older brothers watch younger brothers who have recently done things that cannot be undone, with a steadiness that was worse than anger would have been. There was a structure to those weeks that I came to depend on. Mornings, Takatora and I would walk the perimeter of the sealed Yggdrasil property while the city woke up around us. Afternoons, Zack worked with the neighborhood associations on the vine clearance crews, which he'd organized with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned his organizational skills from watching a charismatic disaster and taking careful notes on what not to do. Evenings, Oren cooked, badly but with tremendous confidence, and Janauchi ate everything put in front of him with a gratitude that suggested he'd never quite trusted that a meal would be there until it was. I kept the records. Patrol logs, clearance progress, incident reports. Bureaucratic work for a peacetime that hadn't fully arrived yet. I was good at it. I had always been better with detail than with the large gestures, and the large gestures had caused enough trouble. The city healed. Slowly, incrementally, the way cities always heal, with argument and complaint and occasional setbacks, one neighborhood making progress while the next still had vine runners pushing through the pavement, a functioning school reopening 3 blocks from a building that still had Helheim spores sealed behind its walls. The people of Zawame were not unacquainted with adversity. The corporation had been running their lives since before most of them were old enough to form opinions about it, and the year of the riders, which was what people were calling the year of the war, flatly and without drama, had simply been the most visible expression of a structural violence that had always been present underneath the polished corporate surface. They knew how to keep going. They'd been practicing for a long time. What none of us were prepared for was the return of the dead. I was sleeping on a cot in the logistics hub on the night it started. Zach shook me awake at 2 in the morning with the particular economy of movement that combat veterans develop, no words, just a hand on my shoulder and 3 fingers held up, which was our signal for unidentified contact, multiple targets. I was dressed and had my Sengoku driver on before I was fully conscious. There's a quality of readiness that you build over months of conflict that doesn't fully go away in the quiet months afterward. Your body keeps the knowledge even when your mind is trying to rest. The air outside was wrong. I could smell it immediately, not Helheim's specific rot, but something adjacent to it. Something that had studied Helheim from a distance and learned its grammar without truly understanding what the words meant. It was the smell of power borrowed from a dead thing, wearing the dead thing's face. There's a particular quality to that kind of wrongness that I don't know how to name more precisely than that. It was as if the air itself knew it was being used for purposes it hadn't agreed to. Takatora was already in the street. He had the Genesis driver fitted, the lemon energy lockseat in his palm, and his face wore the expression I'd learned to recognize in the last months, not calm exactly. Controlled. There's a difference. Calm is the absence of urgency. Controlled is urgency that has been organized into something functional, packaged neatly enough that it can be deployed without losing anything to waste. Northeast quadrant, he said, near the old Droopers venue. Droopers? I knew the name. Everyone in Zawame knew the name. It was where the dance crews had contested for territory back when that was still the kind of thing that mattered, when our greatest concern was which team got to perform on which corner of the city, before the dimensional tiers started opening, and we learned that the universe was vast and mostly hostile and entirely indifferent to which teenagers had the better choreography. The venue had been derelict for a year. Nobody had reason to go there anymore. It sat at the edge of the district that had taken the worst of the vine growth, and even with the clearance work mostly complete, the buildings around it had a quality of emptiness that the surrounding neighborhoods didn't, as if the area remembered what it had been used for and wasn't sure yet whether to forgive itself. Something had reason to go there tonight. We went on foot, staying low. Oren had the others, Zach and Janauchi, coming in from the west side, which I thought was an interesting allocation of resources given that I would have kept Oren on the eastern approach for his reach advantage. But Takatora's tactical decisions were not things I argued with unless I had very specific cause. His track record was better than mine, and not only in military matters. Takatora and I took the east. Half a block out I stopped walking because the thing in the street ahead of us had stopped moving too, and I understood in the sudden silence that it had known we were coming. Not sensed us, known. There's a difference in behavior between a creature that has detected a threat and reacted, and an intelligence that had predicted the threat's arrival and was waiting for the most useful moment of the encounter. This was the second kind. I had seen overlords before. I had fought alongside them and against them, and I had watched what the Helheim spores did to a human body when it consumed the wrong fruit. The dissolution of everything that had been individual about a person, replaced by something vast and old and hungry that used the former person's shape the way a hermit crab uses a shell, without any consideration for the shell's original contents. I thought I was past being frightened by them. I had catalogued what they could do and built reasonable countermeasures, and filed the fear in a drawer that I kept shut during operations. That had served me adequately for months. What stood in the street outside Droopers was not like the overlords I remembered. It was wearing one, the way a puppeteer wears a puppet. The body moved with the heavy rolling gait of an overlord in siege configuration, the vine-wrapped lower body, the slab shoulders, the hands like geological formations that had decided to become fists, but something rode behind the eyes that was not Helheim, not the forest's dumb consuming hunger. This was intelligence. Old, patient, organizing intelligence. The kind that had watched civilizations grow and collapse, and noted down the lessons in a ledger it intended to use. Beside it were others. They were wrong in the same way, inhabited, occupied, their faces familiar to me with an intimacy that struck me low in the chest before I had time to prepare for it. Seed Ryoma Sengoku, Yoko Hayes. Seed, who had been the corporation's agent and had died as one. Ryoma, the professor, the architect of the Sengoku driver system and everything that had come from it, dead by the hand of someone he had raised up. Yoko, who had served Kaido and who I had not known well enough to grieve properly when she was gone. And Hayes. Ryoji Hayes, who had been one of us once, who had belonged to the Raid Wild crew and come into the war with the same mix of ambition and unprocessed fear that most of us had come in with. He had eaten the wrong fruit by accident and hadn't had anyone quick enough or skilled enough to save him. And that was one of the specific weights I had been carrying since it happened, because quick enough and skilled enough described people who had been in the area and had other priorities at the time, and one of those people had been me. He was looking at me with eyes that didn't recognize me. I filed the memory of the last time those eyes had any warmth in them in the place I keep things I don't have room to feel right now. The intelligence spoke. It came from everywhere at once, not from the overlord body it inhabited, but from the air, from the pavement, from the dark above us. It named itself. It called itself Maja, and later I would learn that the name meant demon serpent in the old language, which was either a statement of intent or a warning or both. It said it had been present at the erosion of the earth. It had watched the Helheim advance and Sagara's strange game and Kauda's transformation into something beyond a man, and it had concluded that humanity was now defenseless. The god was gone. The weapons were scattered. The five of us who remained were enough to be interesting for a few minutes, but not enough to be a genuine obstacle. It was not wrong, technically. That's what I remember thinking in that moment, not fear, not anger, but the cold acknowledgement that the entity had done its assessment correctly, and there was nothing in our current configuration that would make the assessment wrong. We were 5 riders. Our strongest was gone. The Kiwami Lockseed, the artifact that had represented the apex of what our transformation system could produce, had left with Kauda. What remained was functional, experienced, and severely outgunned. Then it did the thing I had not anticipated. It turned toward Kauda specifically, toward the space where Kauda should have been, which was a space that still existed somehow in the dimensional memory of Zawame, the coordinates of a presence too significant to simply stop leaving its mark, and something opened in the air above Droopers. I don't have better language for it than that. A seam. A vertical cut in reality about 3 meters tall, edges that shivered slightly as if the surrounding air didn't like what was on the other side of them, and from it came a figure I recognized the shape of before I recognized the face. Before I processed anything specific about the form, my body had already catalogued it as something that should not exist and filed the response under threat, maximum priority. The armor was Kauda's. Orange and dark metal, the Sengoku driver on his belt, the Kiwami Lockseed locked in its cradle, but the colors were inverted. Where there should have been warmth, there was shadow. Where there should have been the specific quality of light that Kauda's Kiwami arms had always thrown, that sunrise orange, that sense of something both ancient and forward-moving, something that had chosen to be here rather than somewhere safer. There was instead a black and sour luminescence that felt like light learning how to be the absence of itself. Maja had made a copy, not a clone, not a body, a resonant negative. It had taken the memory of Kauda that existed in the dimensional architecture of the area and reversed it, the way you can find the shadow of a hand by removing the hand and lighting what's left. I would call it game yami in my own head afterward. The dark image of what Kauda Kazuraba had become, wearing his power without any of his reason, without any of his specific human stubbornness, or his infuriating refusal to accept that some things couldn't be saved. The dark game walked out of that seam in the air and looked at us, and the Kiwami lockseed on its belt pulsed once with a light that was not light, and I understood with complete clarity that we were going to lose this engagement. I transformed anyway, the familiar weight of the Sengoku driver settling against my hip, the pine lockseed in my hand, the transformation sequence that I had run several thousand times now with varying degrees of urgency. I ran it again, and I was Kamen Rider Ryujin, and I went forward to meet something that outmatched me in every quantifiable way. That's the part I want to be clear about, for anyone who hears this story and assumes that what I did next was brave. It wasn't brave. Brave implies that you've calculated the odds and made a choice anyway. I hadn't calculated anything. I went forward because Takatora was going forward, and I have spent the last 2 years of my life trying to be the kind of person who stands where my brother stands, and that was the whole of my decision-making process. Not strategy, not courage. Just the particular gravity that certain people exert on the people who love them, pulling you in the direction they're moving whether you intended to go that way or not. The dark game hit me so hard I went through a wall. I lay in the rubble of what had been someone's workshop. I could see tools on the shelves above me, a grinder, some kind of lathe, all coated in the rust of 7 months' abandonment. A pair of heavy gloves hung on a hook by the door. Someone had stacked wooden pallets in the corner with the intention of organizing them more carefully later. The ordinary accumulated evidence of an ordinary life that the war had interrupted, and through which I was currently lying in pieces. I took inventory. Both arms working. Left knee had taken the impact wrong and was making a complaint that I noted and set aside. Driver intact. Lockseed intact. Nothing that would stop me from continuing. The dark game stood in the hole it had made in the wall and looked at me with Kauda's face, wearing an expression Kauda had never worn, and something happened to my head. The best way I can describe it is this. Imagine your memory is a room you've been living in for years, and someone walks in and takes all the furniture. Not destroying it, taking it. The room is still recognizably yours. You can see the marks on the floor where the heavy pieces sat. You can see the lighter patches on the walls where pictures hung. You can see the groove worn in the floorboards where you always stood to look out the window. But the objects themselves are gone. And without them, the room feels like a place you've visited once in a dream and can't quite map onto waking reality. That was my head afterward. I was still Mitsuzane. I still had language, still had basic function. Still had the capacity for loyalty and fear, and the particular grinding sensation in the chest that I had come to understand was what guilt felt like when it had nowhere to go. But the specific memories, Kauda's name, the color of his armor, what he had meant to all of us, the specific reason the orange of his Kiwami lockseed had made something in my chest ache whenever I saw it, those were gone, lifted out cleanly, and taken somewhere I couldn't reach. I deactivated without understanding why I'd been transformed in the first place. The man who walked out of the rubble and into the cold street of the northeast quadrant of Zawame was not certain of much. He was young and felt it in a way he hadn't felt young in a long time. Not the good kind of young, not the version that means unburdened and full of possibility, but the disoriented young of someone who has been set back to an earlier state, without being given the context that would make that state navigable. He was wearing a Sengoku driver and carrying lockseeds, and had no clear understanding of what those objects were for. He had the impression of urgency, of something important that needed doing, but the specific content of the importance was gone, and what remained was a free-floating anxiety that had no object. What I had left was Takatora's face. I don't know why Maja left that. Perhaps the memory of a sibling is stored in a different architectural layer than the memory of a battle. Perhaps the entity miscalculated what was essential and what was peripheral. Perhaps Takatora is simply too large a fact in my consciousness to extract without taking the whole of me with it. The way certain structural members in a building can be removed and the building survives, but others take the whole thing down. Whatever the reason, when I emerged from that wall and stood blinking in the cold morning street, the face I recognized was my brother's. Takatora was bleeding from a gash above his eye. The Genesis driver was dented along the lower housing. He was still upright, which told me everything I needed to know about Takatora Kirishima's relationship with pain, which was that he acknowledged its existence, and then conducted himself as if the acknowledgement was sufficient response. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not the controlled face, but something underneath it, something older and more careful. The face he made when he was managing something that required more delicacy than his usual tools provided. He said, "Can you walk?" I said I could. He said, "Then walk with me." We walked. I didn't ask where we were going. I didn't ask what had happened or what the name of the thing in the street was. I walked because my brother was walking, and because the smell of the air behind us, that borrowed Helheim sweetness layered over something older and colder, something that smelled of time and the patient accumulation of information, told me clearly enough that walking toward it would have been the wrong direction. Oren found us 3 blocks down. He was carrying Janauchi over one shoulder in the manner of a man who has decided that another man's dignity is less important than that man's continued existence, and he set Janauchi down against a wall with a gentleness that contradicted the posture entirely. The same way Oren did most things, with the contrast between the theatrical exterior and what lay underneath it. Janauchi had a long cut across his left forearm, and the expression of someone who has recently had an experience they're still processing, and have not yet arrived at an opinion about. Zach was there too, moving on his own, a long tear in his jacket from shoulder to elbow, but nothing structurally wrong. They looked at me, and something passed between them that I couldn't read. A held breath. Oren's eyes going briefly wide and then deliberately flat, the expression of a man deciding in real time to table his reaction and deal with the operational reality instead. He doesn't remember, Takatora said, not a question. Some things, I said, which was accurate. I remembered the driver. I remembered the spores. I remembered enough of the war's general architecture to understand that the thing in the street had been dangerous and was still out there and had done something to my head. What I didn't have were the specifics, the names, the faces, the particular weight of what had been won and lost, and why it mattered beyond the immediate operational facts. Zach looked at the ceiling. He was doing something with his jaw that suggested he was preventing himself from saying something, and had decided the prevention was the right call. Janauchi said quietly from the wall where he was still sitting, "The lockseeds, if he gets his lockseeds back." Takatora cut him off with the particular efficiency he used for ideas that were correct but untimely. One problem at a time. The first night we stayed in the logistics hub and Takatora told me things. He was methodical about it, no wasted words, the way he approached everything, but with a gentleness underneath the efficiency that I suspected was not his natural mode and that he'd developed specifically for this purpose. He told me about the dance crews, about the forest and what it had wanted and how it had gotten into the city, about the corporation and its experiments and the cost of that research in human lives, the cost that had been paid not by the people making the decisions but by everyone else, which is generally how those accounts work out. He told me about Kauta Kazuraba, the former street dancer who had become something the universe used to test itself, and about what Kauta had chosen to become, and what it had cost him. He didn't tell me everything. Some of it I could see him deciding to withhold, his eyes moving to a particular middle distance, a brief pause, and then a clean pivot to the next fact. I understood from the shape of those silences that there were things I had done which he was choosing not to lead with. That was the most characteristic thing he could have done, I think. Takatora Kirishima, protecting his little brother from information that the little brother had earned in the worst way possible, deciding that the protection was more important than the full accounting, at least for tonight. I didn't press. I stored what he gave me and went to sleep on my cot and dreamed of colors I couldn't name, orange most prominently, a specific orange that felt like something I was supposed to know the significance of and couldn't quite reach. Maja came back the next morning. The approach was different this time, no grand arrival, no opening seam in the air. The signal was subtler. Oren was the first to notice it. He was on the roof of the hub with a cup of something he'd managed to brew from the limited contents of the emergency pantry, a ritual he maintained with the dedication he brought to all his culinary practices, regardless of the quality of available ingredients. And he came down the stairs at a pace that was frankly inconsistent with a man his age and build, and said the vines were moving. Not Helheim vines. These were darker, thicker, with a quality of movement that suggested they were carrying data rather than nutrients, processing something, routing information toward a central point the way the corporation's fiber network had routed data before Yggdrasil's infrastructure collapsed. They had appeared in the 3 streets surrounding our building during the night, growing slowly and quietly while we slept, and had reached the point of maturity with the patience of something that had been watching us long enough to know we needed sleep, and had scheduled its operations accordingly. Maja was not in a body this time. The voice came from the vines directly, distributed across the network, each section of vine carrying one component of the sound so that it arrived assembled in our ears without having originated in any single place. It offered a transaction. The city for Kauta, not Kauta himself. Maja was clear about that. Kauta was beyond its reach, and it had the self-awareness to admit it. What it wanted was the mirror image it had made, the dark echo, and the territorial anchor it needed to consolidate this dimensional layer under its governance. The city, in exchange for which Maja would release the copy of Kauta and withdraw its overlord presence, and let the 5 of us leave unmolested. A reasonable offer, on its face, if you were the kind of entity that believed humans were primarily motivated by survival and would exchange almost anything to preserve it. Takatora's answer was immediate and not polite. What followed was the second engagement, which went worse than the first in every measurable way. Maja brought Demushu and Ridyu, 2 of the true overlords, the bodies fully occupied now. The intelligence behind the eyes running their combat behavior with a precision the original overlords had never quite achieved because the original overlords had been, in their terrible way, genuine individuals with something like pride and something like ego, which meant they could be read, could be predicted, could be provoked into decisions that served your purposes. These versions had none of that. They had tactics. They had efficiency. They executed patterns without the individual variation that makes a fighter human and therefore legible. There is a meaningful difference when you are on the receiving end. The difference between fighting a person and fighting a system, and the system does not make the mistakes that cost people fights. Demushu came through the wall. That was always how Demushu came, no preamble, no announcement, just mass and velocity, and the settled conviction that the wall was less relevant than the objective on the other side of it. Takatora met him. My brother had been fighting overlords for longer than I had, and he had developed the specific technique of fighting something vastly stronger than himself, that consists primarily of not allowing it to land cleanly, constant movement, angles of engagement that forced the overlord to commit more precision than it preferred, exploiting the gap between the intelligence directing the body and the body's own lag time. It was not dominant. It was survival at a high operational tempo, which is its own kind of skill. I took Riju, or Riju took me, depending on how you want to score the first 30 seconds. The entity moved with a fluidity that was wrong in the specific way that things moving faster than their apparent mass should allow are always wrong. The eye protests. The body has a half-second of confusion between what it's seeing and what physics says should be happening. And I spent those first seconds simply not dying, which was the correct priority, and which I am satisfied with in retrospect, though it was not entirely satisfying in the moment. I did not have my full memory. That was the context of this fight. I was operating on the structure Takatora had given me the night before, the skeleton of what had happened and why, without the specific lived knowledge that would have told me how Riju moved, what its tells were, the particular vulnerability in its left side that I had learned in an earlier engagement. I was fighting a known opponent with the knowledge of a first contact, and the disadvantage showed. What I had was the competence of the body. The body knows its training separately from the narrative mind's inventory of when and how it acquired that training. My hands knew the Ryujin form. My feet knew the engagement distance. My reflexes had been built by experience I couldn't consciously access, and they ran without my management, which is not an ideal way to fight but is considerably better than not running at all. Zack was fighting Hace. I saw his face during it only once, just a glimpse, when our paths crossed briefly in the middle of the street, and I turned away from what I saw there. Some things you give people the privacy of. What Zack Yamamoto was doing in that fight was not combat in the clean tactical sense. It was something older and more costly, the kind of thing that leaves marks that don't show on the outside. Oren and Janouchi had the revived dead. Seed, Yoko, Ryoma Sengoku. Oren was magnificent in a way that I think even he would have been reluctant to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would require him to be serious about himself, and seriousness was not Oren's preferred register. He fought Seed and Yoko simultaneously with the economy of movement of a man who has been fighting his entire adult life and knows exactly what he is. And he kept Janouchi behind him with the care of a man who has decided unilaterally that this particular person is his to protect. Ryoma in particular was a problem even under Maja's control, because Ryoma Sengoku had been a genius whose specific genius had been for finding structural weaknesses in things. And death had apparently not diminished the quality of that vision, only redirected it toward more immediate applications. Then Majigame appeared above the engagement, not descending, hovering, suspended in the air above the intersection with no visible means of support, the dark light from the Kiwami Lockseed throwing its wrong illumination across the street below. It wasn't fighting. It was observing, which I found more disturbing than if it had been fighting. It was running a calculation, watching us work, watching our patterns, nodding our decision-making rhythms, taking notes on what we were, in real time, so that the intelligence behind everything could make a more accurate model. Then it reached into me again. The second extraction was different from the first because I knew what was happening. I could feel it, not pain exactly, but the sensation of something being unlocked and lifted, the specific wrongness of a door being opened that opens only in one direction. The door swings, and there is nothing on the other side of it but absence, and the thing being removed passes through and is gone. I grabbed for what I still had. I held onto Takatora's face. I held onto the smell of the logistics hub in the morning, bad food, and the specific brand of instant coffee that Zack preferred, and the faint chemical residue that lingered in all Yggdrasil property regardless of how thoroughly it had been cleaned. I held on to the abstract certainty that the thing doing this to me was wrong, not just wrong in the tactical sense of being an opponent, but wrong in the deeper sense of being an entity that should not exist in this world and had decided to exist here anyway by force, by the exploitation of a grief it had not earned and a power it had not built. I held onto my own name. Mitsuzane. Mitsuzane Kirishima. Younger brother, former trader, Kamen Rider Ryujin, alive in Zawame City on a morning that smelled of borrowed death and the distant chemical ghost of the Helheim forest that we had fought very hard to remove from this city, and which something was trying to drag back in through the side door of the dead. I held onto all of it, I planted my feet, and I stayed. When the second extraction failed, Majigame dropped from its hover and hit the ground 20 meters away and looked at me with the eyes that weren't Kauta's eyes, and I looked back at it. I was breathing hard. My left knee was worse than it had been the night before. The extraction attempt had left something that felt like a bruise in a place where bruises aren't normally located, some interior compartment of the self that had been grabbed and had not quite let go cleanly. I said, "Whatever you took from me, I remember enough." That was when Kaido came back. I have to be careful about how I explain this because I don't fully understand it myself, and I've had months to think about it. Kaido Kumon had died. He had done what Kaido Kumon would always have done if you gave him enough power and enough provocation. He had challenged the strongest thing he could find, and the strongest thing he could find had been Kauta Kazuraba and the full expression of what Kauta had become, and Kaido had fought that fight to its conclusion without flinching or asking for terms or taking the offered exit. He had been, in his own way, a man of complete integrity. I had not liked him. I had not trusted him. I had spent 18 months considering him an obstacle and a complicating factor. None of that changed the fact that when he came walking out of the vines at the south end of the street with his Baron driver engaged and the lemon energy loxied in his hand, I felt something in my chest that I could only call relief, sharp and involuntary, the kind that arrives before you've decided to feel it. Maja had thought Kaido was his. The vines had reached him, the extraction had begun, and the intelligence had concluded that the man who had spent his entire life wanting to be the strongest would surrender what remained of himself in exchange for more power. This was the flaw in Maja's calculation. It had modeled human ambition accurately, but had mistaken Kaido Kumon's specific quality of wanting. Kaido did not want power for the sake of having it. He wanted it because he wanted to prove something about the world that the world had spent his entire life denying him, and the specific thing he wanted to prove had already been settled between him and Kauta in their last battle. There was nothing Maja could offer him that he hadn't already stood across from, and decided he could accept losing. He had stayed in the vines, played dormant, watched Maja move its pieces and make its assumptions. He came out of the south end of the street and he said, looking at me, "You're still standing." His face had the expression it always had, closed. Evaluating, offering nothing easily. He moved like someone who had taken significant damage and had assessed it and filed it as insufficient reason to change his behavior. I said, "Some of me." He nodded once, which was acknowledgement enough from Kaido Kumon, who had a finely calibrated sense of what acknowledgement was worth and did not overspend it. He went for Majigame. What happened next I can describe in terms of what I saw, though the full meaning of it didn't reach me until afterward, when I had more of myself back. Kaido was not fighting to win the engagement in the conventional sense. He was fighting with a specific objective, creating an opening for a specific outcome. And he pursued that objective with the focus of someone who has stopped caring about anything else in the world, which in Kaido's case was not a metaphor. He took the dark game apart with Baron's efficiency. The lemon energy arms form was built for sustained high damage output, and Kaido applied it exactly. Not the showy way, not the dominating the space way, but the clean technical way. The way of someone who knows exactly what the next 20 seconds require and is spending himself precisely to achieve them. He drove Majigame back across the street, through its guard, through its counter-attempts, and finally down, with the dark armor on one knee and Kaido behind it with both arms locked across its body, the full weight of Baron's form holding it in a configuration it couldn't easily break. He looked at me over the dark game's shoulder. He said, "Fire." The Kiwami Lockseed was on the belt in front of me. My weapon was in my hand. Kaido was holding the target. He was holding it and looking at me and telling me to fire, and the implication of what I was being asked to do was clear. The damage radius of the shot I was being asked to take would not be precise, would not leave Kaido in the clean position he was currently in. He knew that. He was telling me to do it anyway, with the complete composure of a man who had already decided what the calculation was and was done discussing it. I fired. The Kiwami Lockseed disengaged from the dark game's belt in a flash of orange that was the right orange, the warm orange, Kauda's orange, the sunrise orange that I had been dreaming about without having the word for it. The dark game came apart. Not explosively, more like dispersed, the negative image finding the positive image, no longer anchored to an object and losing its coherence. The way a shadow loses definition as you move the light source closer to the object casting it. The copies of the dead flickered across the intersection. Hayes looked at Zack for 1 second with eyes that seemed almost like Hayes's eyes, the real ones, before the intelligence behind them reasserted itself, and then that too dissolved. And then he was gone, and Zack stood very still for a moment in the middle of the street with his hands at his sides. Kaido was still standing. He had taken the impact. He was standing. I had the Kiwami Lockseed in my hand, warm against my palm, throwing that orange light, and I had something else beginning, a cascade. The specific weight of the Lockseed, the orange warmth of it, the particular resonant energy it was putting into the air around me, was triggering something. Not memory in the way memory usually works, not a sequence of events assembling themselves in chronological order, not the drawer in the room opening to reveal the furniture. It was an emotional truth arriving all at once, like a wall of water, like pressure equalizing. I knew who Kauda was. Not the facts of him, not yet, but the specific quality of him, what he'd felt like to stand beside, what it had meant to have someone that certain and that relentless choosing to protect the city even when the city didn't know it needed protecting. And then Mai's voice. I cannot explain where it came from. It was not auditory in the normal sense. It came from the same place the emotional truth had come from the resonant memory of the Kiwami Lockseed, from whatever record the most powerful artifact in our transformation system kept of the people it had been bonded to. It was faint, not words exactly, more like the impression of words settling into a place that had been prepared for them. She said, "You've mastered fate," she said, "Make a miracle." She said it the way she always said things. I was suddenly certain, with that quality of being entirely serious about something that other people might have considered too large to say plainly. I heard it. I don't expect that to make sense to someone who wasn't standing in that intersection holding that Lockseed. The cascade finished. My name fully inhabited, Mitsuzane Kirishima, every syllable landing in its correct place. The Sengoku driver on my hip, fully understood, every use it had ever been put to returning in weight and implication. The furniture back in the room, the pictures back on the walls. The driver in my hand that was not mine, Kauda's artifact, Kauda's power, the concentrated expression of what the best of us had chosen to become, understood for what it was. Not something that could be permanently transferred, not something I could keep or would want to keep, but something that could be borrowed for exactly as long as this moment required and would be returned in good condition. I transformed. I want to say it felt like becoming someone else. It felt like becoming entirely myself, more myself than I had been in 2 years, more than I had been in the long months of operating under a plan that had required me to become unrecognizable to everyone I loved. I had been performing Mitsuzane Kirishima for so long that I had forgot the original performance was supposed to have been the real thing. In that moment, in Kiwami arms, with the full expression of everything the system had ever been able to produce running through my body like current through a properly closed circuit, I felt like someone who had come back to a place they had lived and found it recognizably home. Maja came directly. No more proxies, no more managed engagement from a comfortable distance. The intelligence came in its own form, the Maja arms it had built from the dimensional architecture that had been its medium since long before any of us had been born, and it hit with the full force of something that had been waiting for the right moment to stop being subtle. I don't want to make this into something cleaner than it was. I was exhausted and operating in a form I had never trained in. Kaido was hurt, and managing it with the particular stoicism of someone who has decided the management is all that's available. The others were still working the edges of the street. Takatora was running on the specific reserve that my brother runs on when the situation demands he refuse to stop, and that reserve is real and extensive, but it is not infinite, and I could see the cost of it in the set of his shoulders. What was different now was that we were together. That sounds simple. It is simple. Maja had modeled our individual capabilities accurately. It had assessed 5 riders and concluded correctly that no single one of us could threaten what it was doing. What it had not modeled was what happened when 5 people who had separately fought through the same impossible year stood next to each other and stopped calculating individually. It had not modeled Oren placing himself between Janauchi and a killing strike with the complete certainty of a man who has already decided that this is where he stands, that this person is under his protection, that the discussion is closed. It had not modeled Zack taking a blow that should have ended his engagement and finding another 3 seconds in himself, because 3 seconds was what was needed, and he had 3 seconds available, and that was the whole of his accounting. It had not modeled Takatora pressing the attack from Maja's left flank at the precise moment. I drove it backward from the center. The 2 of us moving with the coordination of people who have been reading each other since before either of us was old enough for the reading to have any weight. I am not the strongest fighter among us. I never have been, and the Kiwami arms form was not designed for my hands. What I could do in that form, with every lockseed the system had ever produced cycling through the arsenal, was be exactly hard enough to refuse to stop for the duration that mattered. That's the human thing. Not the dramatic gestures, not the impossible last stand in the story sense. Just the refusal to be done before the work is done, maintained past the point where refusing makes sense by any metric, except the one you're holding onto. Maja adapted. That was the terrible thing about the intelligence. It was fast, genuinely fast, and every time we found an approach that worked it recalibrated and closed the opening within seconds. We spent 11 minutes in the middle of that street that felt like considerably longer. My arms were burning with the specific fire of muscles being asked for more than they have. The Kiwami arms form has a physical cost that Kauta had managed over months of practice, and that I was learning all at once. Every time I wanted to slow down, I thought about Takatora bleeding above his eye and walking anyway, and I didn't slow down. Then Takatora gave me Roseyu's sword. It was the only artifact we had that Maja had not fully assessed. Roseyu had been the Overlord King, the oldest, the most powerful, the one who had understood the Helheim forest at its deepest level, because he had watched it consume his own people from the beginning, and had chosen to fight it and failed and been consumed himself. His sword had been built for a different kind of hand by a different kind of intelligence, and it carried with it the complete record of that loss. Takatora had recovered it from the ruins of the Overlord Citadel and had been carrying it for 6 months as a contingency. He had never told me he had it. That was Takatora. He carries contingencies the way other men carry keys, quietly and without announcement, and produces them at the moment when the need is evident without taking any time to be acknowledged for the foresight. He pressed it into my hands between exchanges, when Maja was briefly recalibrating after a sequence it hadn't expected. The sword in Kiwami arms was not subtle. It was the kind of ending that leaves no room for argument, not a clever technique, not a system exploit, not even primarily a martial decision. It was the full weight of the most powerful single-use weapon in the field brought to bear on an entity that had made the mistake of concentrating itself into a single point to manage its combat behavior more efficiently. I drove the engagement for 30 seconds, Takatora on the left, Kaido on the right, Zack and Oren and Janouchi closing the triangle from behind in a formation none of us had ever practiced and all of us knew how to hold. And when the opening came, I took it with both hands, not because I was certain it would work, but because the opening was there, and certainty was not something the moment was offering and never had been. Maja came apart the way false things come apart. Not explosively, the intelligence had too much self-regard for an explosive end. It dispersed. It unwound from the overlord bodies and the vine network and the revived dead and the dimensional architecture it had built in the northeast quadrant over the past 3 days, and it became the air, which is the best description I have for what I watched. The smell of it, that borrowed sweetness, that cold, patient intelligence underneath, dissipated. The vines in the surrounding streets went still. Hayes stopped and looked at Zack, and for a moment his expression completed itself, the real one returning for the instant before the coherence that had been holding the form in place dissolved entirely. Then he was gone, and Zack stood very still in the street with his hands at his sides, and nobody said anything to him for a while, which was the right call. I deactivated. The Kiwami lockseed was warm in my hand. I looked at it for a long time. Kaido was sitting against the wall of the building at the east edge of the street, arms on his knees, head down, breathing in the controlled way of someone managing significant pain, and applying their considerable organizational capacity to making the pain legible and quantifiable. I sat down next to him. The street was quiet around us. The particular quiet after a violent thing has stopped being violent, when everyone present is taking inventory, and the city is deciding what comes next. After a while he said, "Don't hold on to that," meaning the lockseed. I said I knew. He said, "It's his. He'll need to know someone kept it safe." I said, "How will he know?" Kaido looked at me with the expression he had when someone asked a question he considered unnecessary, or when someone asked a question to which the answer was obvious and they simply hadn't thought through the obvious. "Because Mai will tell him. Because they left, they didn't die. There's a difference, Mitsuzane." It was the first time he'd used my name. I noticed it. I set the lockseed down on the pavement between us, and we looked at it together in the pale morning light of Zawame City, which was cold and real and entirely uncontaminated by the forest now, the way a city should be. 2 blocks over I could hear Oren beginning to lecture Janouchi about something at considerable volume, and with apparent enthusiasm, the lecture including what sounded like terminology from professional pastry preparation applied to combat technique. I could hear Takatora's voice, low and steady, saying something to Zack, not the tactical debrief voice, but the other one, the one he used for matters that required more precision than strategy could provide. The city was coming back to itself the way cities always do after violence, cautiously, incrementally, a door opening here and a light coming on there, and someone deciding the immediate threat is over, and the ordinary requirements of the morning are reasserting their claim. From somewhere 3 streets over came the sound of someone moving furniture, which was the most ordinary sound I'd heard in 24 hours, and which landed in my chest with a weight I didn't entirely expect. Takatora found me an hour later. I was sitting on the steps of the Droopers venue in the wrong side of the dawn, my lockseed in my hand, the Kiwami lockseed in its carrying case beside me, waiting for something I couldn't have named. My brother sat next to me. He did not ask how I was, which was correct because the answer was complicated and would have taken time neither of us had, and which he already partially knew anyway. He put his arm around my shoulders the way he had when I was very small, when the world was smaller too, before the corporation and the forest and the experiments, and everything the corporation had done with the forest and the experiments and the city and us. I said, "Tell me the rest of it." He said, "Which part?" I said, "The part you left out last night, what I did." He was quiet for a while, long enough that I started to think he might not answer, or might defer again, might make the decision that protecting me was more important than the truth of what I was. Then he said the things he'd kept back, plainly and without excess. The way Takatora does everything, not performing honesty, not making a moment out of it, just providing information that the other person needs and that he is now prepared to provide. He told me who I had tried to hurt and why, and what it had cost, and what had been salvaged from the cost. He told me about the day I came back. I sat with it. The morning sat with it too. The city went about the business of continuing. After a long time I said, "And you still came to Zawame?" He said, "You're my brother." That's all. 3 words, delivered in the voice of a man who considers the matter closed, who has done his accounting and arrived at a balance and has no interest in reopening the ledger for dramatic purposes. He had decided what I was to him. He had decided it before Zawame, probably, in some way that neither of us had articulated at the time, and the events of the past 2 years had been tested against the decision, and the decision had held. I have spent a lot of time, in the months since that morning, thinking about what Maja had not understood about us, about humans specifically, about the particular variety of human stubbornness that shows up not in the willingness to fight but in the willingness to remain. Maja had done its modeling carefully. It had assessed our combat capability and found it insufficient, which was accurate. It had assessed our emotional states and identified grief and guilt and exhaustion and the long-wearing cost of a year of war, which was also accurate. It had concluded from these findings that we were a manageable obstacle. What it had not modeled, the specific weight of a sibling's forgiveness. The decision a man makes when he chooses to carry a dead king's sword in his coat for 6 months on the chance that there's a day coming when the sword is what's needed. The quality of loyalty that keeps a fighter in a vine network, dormant, conserving himself for the moment when the opening appears, because the alternative is accepting that the opening doesn't come, and that is not an acceptable alternative. The particular form of courage that belongs to people who are afraid and keep showing up anyway, who don't have the narrative clarity that makes heroism feel like a choice rather than a necessity, who just stand in the street because standing in the street is what the situation requires. The Kiwami lockseed is secured at the hub. I check on it every morning, which I understand is not rational. It doesn't require maintenance. It doesn't decay. It exists in the same state each morning that it was in the morning before. But I do it anyway, and I think I'll keep doing it. It feels like the minimum that can be done for something that should be cared for in the absence of its proper owner. Like keeping a fire going for someone who will return to it. Zawame is still there. We are keeping it. 5 riders in a city that survived the end of the world and is discovering, slowly, what it means to build something in the space that the ending left. It's not clean work. It's not the kind of story that has a final scene. The vine growth comes back in small amounts that need clearing. The corporation's sealed sublevels need permanent monitoring. People who were changed by the spores are still living with what they were changed into, and the medical resources for that are inadequate and improving slowly. There are arguments, sometimes, about what Zawame should become now that the corporate structure that built it is gone. What the city owes itself, who gets to decide, which of the old patterns are worth carrying forward, and which ones need to be left in the architecture of a place that no longer exists. I don't know the answer to most of those questions. I show up. I do the work that's in front of me. I check the lockseed in the morning, and I do my patrols, and I eat the bad food in the break room, and I keep the records with the care of someone who understands that the records are how a city eventually knows what it went through and why it survived it. Mitsuzane, my brother, asked me once, "Do you think he'll miss us?" I told him the truth. I think Kauta Kazuraba is doing something that requires the whole of his attention and the whole of what he has become, and I think the missing, if it exists in the form that a human would experience it, gets filed somewhere that doesn't interfere with that work. The work is too large for anything else. That's what it costs when the universe asks you to be what Kauta became. The cost is everything, including the ordinary human grief of being too far away to go back to the place that made you. But I think someday, when whatever he is building in that new place reaches the state where it can sustain itself without him, He'll come back. Not to stay. Just to see. The way you come back to the street you grew up on, not because you expect it to be what it was, not because you need anything from it, but because it is the place that made you, and some part of you will always want to stand in it one more time and know that it's still there. Zawim is still there. We are keeping it for him.